The range scorer squinted at the target, then looked back at his tablet, then at the target again. 3 rounds had gone downrange from lane 14. The paper showed only one hole. He walked the 50 meters to inspect it himself, certain the system had malfunctioned. When he held the target up to the morning light, his confusion deepened. All 3 rounds had passed through the same opening, a single ragged circle no wider than a dime, dead center in the silhouette. He turned to look at the shooter in lane 14, a small soldier with steady hands who was already clearing her weapon, as if nothing remarkable had occurred. Specialist Yemisi Adiyinka had learned to shoot before she learned to ride a bicycle. She had learned patience before she learned to read. And she had learned, above all else, that the quietest person in any room sees everything while being seen by no one. These lessons came from her grandfather, a man whose name once appeared on Olympic rosters and whose hands had shaped hers around a rifle stock when she was barely tall enough to hold one. He had been gone for 8 months now. Some days it felt like 8 minutes. Other days it felt like 8 centuries. The qualification range of Fort Sill stretched across the Oklahoma flatland like a scar, 20 lanes of packed earth and paper targets baking under a sun that showed no mercy even in early morning. Yemisi stood at lane 14, her standard issue M4 cleaned and cleared, watching the other soldiers in her Human Resources Battalion struggle through their annual qualification. Most of them touched a weapon twice a year. Most of them treated it like a chore, something to endure between paperwork and processing forms. She was not most of them. Before we continue with Yemisi and her story, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from today. Maybe you know someone with a hidden talent that nobody ever expected. We would love to hear about it. 3 lanes down, a young private was shaking so badly his rounds were hitting everything except the target. Private First Class Tobias Renner had failed his last 2 qualification attempts, and one more failure meant remedial training that would follow him for months. Yemisi watched him for a moment, watched the tremor in his shoulders and the panic building behind his eyes. She recognized that fear. Her grandfather had taught her to see it in others, to understand that shooting was 10% physical and 90% mental. She walked to his lane during the ceasefire, her boots crunching on spent brass. Renner looked up at her with the desperate hope of a drowning man seeing a life preserver. "You're breathing too fast," she said quietly. "Your heart rate is spiking before you even touch the trigger. Slow down. 1 breath in for 4 counts. Hold for 4. Out for 4. The rifle does not care if you are afraid. It only cares if you're still." Renner stared at her. Nobody from HR had ever spoken to him about anything except leave forms and pay discrepancies. But something in her voice, some absolute certainty, made him listen. When the range went hot again, he tried her method. His first shot hit the target. His second hit closer to center. By his 10th round, he was qualifying for the first time in 6 months. He turned to thank her, but she had already returned to her lane, invisible again, just another desk clerk finishing her mandatory training. Sergeant First Class Wade Hensley walked the line behind the shooters, clipboard in hand, watching the qualification scores populate on his tablet. Hensley was the senior marksmanship instructor at Fort Sill, a 3-time All-Army champion whose reputation preceded him like thunder before a storm. He had the build of a man who had once been athletic and was now merely imposing, thick through the shoulders with hands that looked capable of crushing stone. He paused behind Yemisi just as she fired her final string, watched her grouping appear on the scorer's tablet, watched the scorer frown and manually verify the results. The scorer called out her score. Qualified, expert level, 36 out of 40. Hensley grunted. "Not bad for a paper pusher," he said loudly enough for the entire line to hear. "Maybe next year you will actually be useful in a fight." Yemisi said nothing. She had fired 4 rounds deliberately wide on her final string, spreading her grouping from impossible to merely excellent. She had learned long ago that excellence invited attention, and attention invited questions she did not want to answer. Hensley moved on, stopping at the end of the line to address the assembled soldiers. "Listen up," he announced. "The All-Fort Sill marksmanship competition is in 2 weeks. Winner represents this installation at the Army-level championship." He smiled, and there was no warmth in it. I have won this competition 3 years running. If any of you think you can challenge that record, sign-up sheet is posted at the Cannoneer Club. He scanned the crowd, his gaze passing over Yemisi without pause, dismissing her as he dismissed all the administrative soldiers. Invisible, forgettable, exactly as she preferred. That night, alone in her barracks room, Yemisi sat on the edge of her bunk and stared at the worn leather case beneath her bed. She had not opened it since the funeral, had not touched the rifle inside, the one her grandfather had carried across 3 continents and 2 defections, the one he had placed in her hands when she was 6 years old and said, "This is your inheritance. Not money, not land. Skill. Skill nobody can take from you." Her hand trembled as she reached for the case, then stopped. She was not ready. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But somewhere deep in her chest, beneath the grief and the fear, something else stirred. Something that felt like her grandfather's voice, patient and certain, asking her a question she had been avoiding for 8 months. How long will you hide what you are? She did not have an answer. But when she finally slept, she dreamed of targets and wind and the steady pressure of a trigger beneath her finger. And in the dream, she never missed. The photograph was older than Yemisi herself, its edges soft from years of handling, its colors faded to the warm sepia of memory. In it, a young man stood on a podium, a rifle cradled in his arms like a sleeping child, a medal gleaming against his chest. But Batunde Adeyinka, 23 years old, moments after winning the African Continental Championship in a sport that would eventually force him to flee his homeland. The Nigerian government had wanted him to shoot for them in ways that had nothing to do with paper targets. He had chosen exile instead. He had chosen America. He had chosen, eventually, to pour everything he knew into a granddaughter who showed the same unnatural stillness he had been born with. Yemisi traced the outline of his face with her fingertip. She could still hear his voice, that low rumble that made every instruction sound like wisdom passed down through generations. Shooting is not about the target, little one. It is about you. The target is just where your truth lands. She had not understood that as a child. She was beginning to understand it now. The barracks room was small and sparse, identical to every other room in Building 2201. A bed, a desk, a wall locker, a window that looked out over the Oklahoma plains. Yemisi had added nothing personal to the space except the photograph and the leather case beneath her bed. She did not need decorations. She did not need comfort. She needed only to get through each day without anyone discovering what she was. But the dream from last night lingered. The feel of the rifle in her hands. The absolute clarity of a sight picture. The knowledge, bone deep and certain, that she could not miss if she tried. She slid the photograph back in her desk drawer and headed to work. Building 4187 housed the Human Resources Battalion, a maze of cubicles and filing systems where soldiers came to fix their pay, update their records, and complain about administrative errors that were rarely the fault of the people trying to help them. Yemisi had worked here for 18 months. In that time, she had processed over 4,000 personnel actions, corrected hundreds of pay discrepancies, and helped dozens of soldiers navigate the bureaucratic nightmare of military paperwork. She was good at her job, thorough, precise, invisible. Her supervisor, Staff Sergeant Corinne Dubicki, was waiting at her desk when she arrived. Dubicki was a compact woman in her early 30s, with the kind of eyes that missed nothing and a reputation for protecting her soldiers like a wolf guarding cubs. She had served 2 combat tours before a training accident shattered her knee and ended her infantry career. Now she ran the personnel section with the same intensity she had once applied to clearing buildings. She was also the only person at Fort Sill who knew Yemisi's secret. "Saw your qualification scores yesterday," Dubicki said quietly, leaning against the cubicle wall. "Expert level. 36 out of 40. Yemisi kept her eyes on her computer screen. "That is the standard, Staff Sergeant." Dubicki snorted. "We both know that is not your standard. I have seen you shoot, Adeyinka. That day at the off-post range when you thought nobody was watching. You put 10 rounds through the same hole at 300 meters. Yemisi's fingers paused on the keyboard. "That was a good day. Every day is a good day for you. That is the point. Dubicki lowered her voice. The competition is in 2 weeks. Hensley has won 3 years straight, and he is insufferable about it. Just once, I would love to see someone knock him off that pedestal. I'm not interested in pedestals. Your grandfather was. The words hit Yemisi like a physical blow. She turned slowly to face her supervisor, her expression carefully neutral. You do not know anything about my grandfather. Dubicki held up her hands. I know he was Babatunde Adeyinka. I know he was one of the greatest precision shooters to ever live. And I know he spent 30 years teaching you everything he knew. She paused. I also know he died 8 months ago, and you have not touched a competition rifle since. Yemisi said nothing. The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled tight. I am not trying to push you, Dubicki said finally. I am trying to tell you that hiding does not honor him. He did not teach you so you could process pay forms and pretend to be average. He taught you because you were extraordinary, and he wanted the world to know it. She walked away before Yemisi could respond, leaving her alone with the hum of fluorescent lights and the weight of words she could not escape. The Cannoneer Club was crowded that evening, soldiers unwinding after duty hours with beer and complaints and the particular camaraderie that came from shared misery. Yemisi had not planned to come here. She had planned to return to her barracks, eat a quiet dinner, and continue avoiding the leather case beneath her bed. But Renner had found her in the parking lot, still grateful for her help on the range, insisting she join him for a drink. She had agreed only because saying no would have required more conversation than saying yes. Now she stood near the back wall, nursing a soda she did not want, watching soldiers cluster around the sign-up sheet for the marksmanship competition. Hensley held court near the bar, surrounded by his usual crowd of admirers and sycophants, his voice carrying across the room. Same competition, same result, he was saying. I do not know why they even bother posting a sign-up sheet. Should just mail me the trophy and save everyone the embarrassment. Laughter rippled through his audience. Yemisi watched him, studied the way he carried himself, the absolute certainty in his posture. He was good. She had seen his scores, reviewed his records out of curiosity she would never admit. 3-time champion. Consistent. Disciplined. The kind of shooter who won through preparation and practice rather than natural gift. Her grandfather had been different. Her grandfather had been touched by something that could not be taught, an instinct for the rifle that bordered on the supernatural. And he had given that gift to her. A drunk specialist stumbled toward the sign-up sheet, marker in hand, laughing at some joke his friends had made. He scrawled a name and then turned, scanning the room with bleary eyes. Who else, he called out. Who else wants to lose to Hensley? He spotted Yemisi near the wall. Hey, what about you? The HR girl. Maybe you could bore him to death with paperwork if you cannot shoot him. More laughter. Yemisi felt every eye in the room turn toward her, felt the familiar weight of being seen when she wanted only to disappear. Something shifted in her chest. A spark of anger. A whisper of her grandfather's voice. How long will you hide what you are? She set down her soda and walked toward the sign-up sheet. The room grew quieter with each step she took. Renner watched her with confusion. Dubicki, seated in a corner booth, watched her with something that looked like hope. Yemisi picked up the marker, wrote her name in careful, precise letters, turned and walked out without saying a word. Behind her, the silence shattered into whispers and laughter and disbelief. But beneath all of it, she heard Hensley's voice, stripped of its usual arrogance, asking a question that no one could answer. Who the hell is Adeyinka? The notification appeared on Yemisi's phone at 04:15, a full 45 minutes before her alarm was set to sound. Competition qualification round. Lane 7, 0500. Report time 04:45. She stared at the message in the darkness of her barracks room, understanding immediately what it meant. The qualification rounds were scheduled throughout the day, with most competitors assigned to mid-morning or afternoon slots. The 0500 slot was punishment. It was a message. Someone wanted her tired, rushed, and unprepared. She smiled for the first time in months. Whoever had arranged this did not understand what they were dealing with. Her grandfather had trained her in conditions that made a pre-dawn range session look like a vacation. She had fired in sandstorms and monsoons, in freezing darkness and brutal heat. She had learned to shoot when exhausted, when hungry, when her hands were numb and her eyes were burning. An early morning in Oklahoma was nothing. She was dressed and out the door by 0420, her standard issue M4 cleaned and ready. The walk to Range 12 took 15 minutes across the sleeping base, past darkened buildings and empty motor pools, under a sky just beginning to lighten at its eastern edge. The air was cool and still, carrying the faint smell of dust and diesel that seemed to permeate everything at Fort Sill. The range was empty when she arrived. No SCOTUS, no safety officers, no other competitors, just 20 lanes of packed earth and paper targets waiting in the pre-dawn gray. She checked her watch. 0443. She was early. Footsteps behind her. She turned to find Sergeant First Class Hensley walking toward the range, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He was carrying a tablet and a cup of coffee, dressed in PT gear rather than duty uniform, as if he had just happened to be in the area. "Adiinka," he said, making her name sound like an accusation. "You actually showed up." The notification said 0500, Staff Sergeant. It did. He took a long sip of his coffee. "I wanted to see if you were serious about this little stunt of yours. Signing up for my competition. Making a scene at the club." "I did not make a scene. I signed a piece of paper." Hensley stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath. "Let me explain something to you, specialist. This competition is not for personnel clerks who want attention. It is for real soldiers, shooters, people who actually matter in a fight." Yemisi met his gaze without flinching. Her grandfather had taught her that too. Never look away first. Never let them see you blink. "I qualified expert yesterday," she said. "That makes me eligible for the competition, unless the rules have changed." Something flickered in Hensley's eyes. Anger, maybe, or something older and darker. "The rules have not changed," he said, "but I want you to understand what you are walking into. I have won this competition 3 years running. The soldiers who compete against me are the best shooters on this installation. You're going to embarrass yourself out there. And when you do, everyone is going to remember the HR clerk who thought she could play with the big boys." He turned and walked toward the scorer's table, where a sleepy specialist was just arriving to set up the equipment. Yemisi watched him go, filing away every word, every inflection, every tell in his body language. He was afraid of something. She could see it beneath the arrogance, a tremor of uncertainty that did not match his reputation. Why would a 3-time champion be afraid of a personnel clerk? The qualification round began at 0500 exactly. Yemisi was the only shooter, firing alone on arrangement for 20. Hensley watched from behind the scorer, his arms crossed, his eyes tracking every movement she made. She fired her 40 rounds in standard qualification format. 10 from 50 meters, 10 from 100, 10 from 150, 10 from 200. She controlled her breathing, controlled her trigger press, controlled everything except the final outcome. When the scores came back, she had qualified expert, 34 out of 40. Good enough to advance, unremarkable enough to avoid attention. Hensley looked at the score sheet for a long moment. Then he laughed. 34, he announced to no one in particular. "That is what I shoot warming up." He shook his head. "Good luck in the competition, specialist. You're going to need it." He walked away, taking his coffee and his contempt with him. Yemisi watched him go, then looked down at the target in her hands. The groupings were deliberately scattered, for rounds pulled wide on purpose, her true accuracy hidden beneath a mask of mediocrity. She folded the target and put it in her pocket, evidence of what she was not, a reminder of what she was hiding. Staff Sergeant Dubicki was waiting outside the HR building when Yemisi arrived for duty. Her expression was carefully neutral, but her eyes were sharp. "Heard you had an early morning," Dubicki said. "Word travels fast." Hensley made sure of it. "He has been telling everyone you barely qualified." She paused. 34 is a respectable score, Adiinka. But we both know you could shoot that blindfolded." Yemisi pushed through the door without responding. Dubicki followed her inside, matching her pace through the maze of cubicles. "Why are you hiding?" Dubicki pressed. "You signed up for this. You made a statement. And then you went out there and shot like someone who has never held a rifle before. I shot like someone who qualified. You shot like someone who is afraid." Dubicki grabbed her arm, stopping her in the hallway. "Talk to me. What's going on?" Yemisi pulled her arm free. The words came before she could stop them, spilling out of a place she had kept locked for 8 months. What if he was wrong? What if everything he believed about me was just a grandfather's love, not the truth? What if I go out there and try my best, and it is not enough? Dubicki's expression softened. "You're not afraid of failing. You are afraid of succeeding without him there to see it." The silence between them was heavy with understanding. "He should be here," Yemisi whispered. "You should be the one watching me compete, not sitting in a grave in Houston while I try to figure out who I am without him." Dubicki reached into her pocket and pulled out an envelope, yellowed with age. "I found this in your personnel file. It was tucked into your emergency contact paperwork, sealed with instructions that it only be given to you if you ever needed to remember who you are." Yemisi took the envelope with trembling hands. The handwriting on the front was her grandfather's, each letter precise and familiar. "For my Yemisi," it read, "when you're ready to stop hiding." She did not open it. Not yet. But she carried it with her for the rest of the day, a weight in her pocket that felt like both an anchor and a key. That night, alone in her barracks room, she finally broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in her grandfather's careful script. The first line made her breath catch in her throat. "You were never my student, little one. You were always my equal. Now show them what the Adiinka name means." The letter contained more than those first words. 3 pages of her grandfather's handwriting, dense with memories and instructions and love distilled into ink. Yemisi read it 4 times that night, each pass revealing something new, each sentence a thread connecting her to the man who had shaped everything she was. He wrote about the day she was born, how he had held her in the hospital and known immediately that she had the gift. The stillness, he called it, the ability to exist between heartbeats, to find the silence beneath the noise of the world. He had seen in her eyes before she could even focus them. He wrote about her first shot at age 6, how she had held the rifle with a natural grip that took most shooters years to develop. He wrote about the competitions he had secretly entered her in under false names, in distant states, building a record that existed only in his private journals. She had 117 of them. She had never known. He wrote about his illness, the diagnosis he had hidden from her until the end was inevitable. He wrote about watching her shoot on his final good day, standing behind her at the range they had built together on his property in Houston, knowing it was the last time he would see her do what she was born to do. And he wrote about Hensley. The name appeared on the 3rd page, unexpected and jarring. "Your path may cross with a man named Wade Hensley. We competed together once long ago. He was talented but limited, skilled but not gifted. He could not accept that some things cannot be earned through effort alone. If you meet him, know that his anger is not about you. It is about the truth he cannot face in himself." Yemisi set the letter down and stared at the wall of her barracks room. Her grandfather had known. Somehow, impossibly, he had known that this moment would come, that this confrontation was waiting somewhere in her future. He had prepared her for it without ever saying a word. She reached beneath her bed and pulled out the leather case. The rifle inside was older than she was, a custom-built precision instrument that her grandfather had carried across 3 continents. The stock was worn smooth from decades of use, the metal darkened with age, the scope of vintage Leupold that modern shooters would dismiss as obsolete. But in her hands, it felt like coming home. She assembled it in the darkness, her fingers finding each component by memory, the familiar weight settling into her palms like a handshake from the past. When it was complete, she raised it to her shoulder and found her sight picture against the blank wall. The stillness came immediately, the silence beneath the noise, the space between heartbeats where nothing existed except her and the rifle and the point where her truth would land. She was ready. Range 4 was the precision facility, a 1,000-meter stretch of Oklahoma flatland reserved for serious shooters and specialized training. It was empty at 0300, closed in normal traffic, accessible only to those who knew how to bypass the standard scheduling system. Yemisi had learned that trick from her grandfather years ago. Ranges were never truly closed. They were just waiting for someone who needed them badly enough. She set up at the 500-meter line, her grandfather's rifle resting on its bipod, finding the scope with practiced ease. The targets were barely visible in the darkness, pale shapes against the black backdrop of the berm. She did not need to see them clearly. She knew where they were. She knew where her round would go. The first shot broke the silence like a crack of thunder. The second followed 2 seconds later. The third came after another 2. When she walked down range to check her targets, all 3 rounds had passed through the same hole. She shot until dawn, working through distances from 300 to 800 meters, reacquainting herself with the rifle and the skills she had tried to bury. By the time the sun crested the horizon, she had fired 200 rounds and missed nothing. A figure stood at the edge of the range, watching. She had known he was there for the past hour, had felt his presence without seeing him. Now she turned and faced Command Sergeant Major Victor Okonkwo, the senior enlisted soldier at Fort Sill. He was a tall man in his 50s, Nigerian-American like herself, with a bearing of someone who had spent decades turning chaos into order. He did not speak as she approached, just watched her with eyes that seemed to see everything. "Adiyinka," he said finally. "Your grandfather was Babatunde." It was not a question. "You knew him," she replied. "I competed against him." Okonkwo's expression remained unreadable. "Once, in 1987, I was 23 years old and thought I was the best shooter in the world. He beat me by 40 points and then bought me dinner to explain everything I'd done wrong." Yemisi almost smiled. "That sounds like him. He was the most gifted natural shooter I ever saw." Okonkwo paused. Until now, the words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Yemisi did not know how to respond, so she said nothing. "The first round of competition is tomorrow," Okonkwo continued. "Standard marksmanship. Multiple shooters." He tilted his head slightly. "You have been hiding. I have seen your qualification scores." 34 is an insult to his memory. "I was not ready. And now?" Yemisi looked down at the rifle in her hands, at the worn leather and aged metal that connected her to everything she had lost and everything she still carried. "Now I am his granddaughter," she said, "and I am done pretending to be anything else." Okonkwo nodded once, a gesture that contained more approval than any words could express. Then he turned and walked away, leaving her alone with the sunrise and the rifle and the first real peace she had felt in 8 months. The first competition round was held that afternoon on Range 12. 16 shooters had qualified, competing for 8 spots in the next round. Hensley was there, surrounded by his usual entourage, radiating confidence like heat from a furnace. Yemisi arrived alone, carrying her M4, her grandfather's rifle still hidden in her barracks room. She would not need it today. Today was about sending a message. She shot a 38 out of 40. Good enough to advance. Good enough to place third in the round. Not good enough to threaten Hensley's commanding lead, but good enough to make him look at her differently when the scores were posted. Good enough to make him wonder. That night, she returned to her barracks room to find the door slightly ajar. She pushed it open slowly, her senses alert, her body tense. The leather case had been moved. It sat in the center of her bed now, unlatched, the lid hanging open. Her grandfather's rifle was still inside. Nothing appeared to be missing. But when she lifted the scope to check it, her blood ran cold. Someone had turned the adjustment dials. The zeroing was completely off, random settings that would send her round wild at any distance beyond 50 meters. Sabotage, deliberate and precise. She sat on the edge of her bed and stared at the ruined scope, understanding finally that this was not just a competition. This was war. Yemisi did not sleep that night. She sat on her barracks floor with the scope disassembled before her, each component laid out on a clean cloth like surgical instruments awaiting use. The damage was worse than she had initially thought. Whoever had done this knew exactly what they were doing. The elevation turret had been spun to its maximum setting. The windage was cranked hard right, and the internal reticle had been jarred loose, probably by a sharp impact against something hard. This was not casual vandalism. This was the work of someone who understood precision optics and wanted to ensure she could not compete at distance. She thought about reporting it, thought about going to the military police, filing a complaint, demanding an investigation. But she knew how that would play out. No witnesses, no evidence beyond her word. And Hensley's reputation as a senior NCO and three-time champion would shield him from any serious scrutiny. Besides, her grandfather had taught her something more valuable than marksmanship. He had taught her that the best revenge was victory. The scope was beyond field repair. She would need tools and time she did not have to fix the internal damage. Round 2 of the competition was scheduled for 0900, less than 8 hours away. 300-meter shooting, precision scored, where a damaged scope would be obvious to everyone watching. She had 2 choices: withdraw and let them win, or compete with iron sights and prove that her skill did not depend on technology. There was really only one choice. Dawn found her at range 4 again, this time with the rifle stripped of its scope entirely. The iron sights were original to the weapon, installed by her grandfather decades ago, simple metal posts that required the shooter to do everything the scope would normally handle automatically. Range estimation, wind calculation, elevation adjustment, all of it processed through experience and instinct rather than glass and turrets. She fired 50 rounds at 300 meters. Her groupings were wider than they would have been with the scope, but still tighter than most shooters could manage with the best equipment available. It would have to be enough. The second round drew a larger crowd than the first. Word had spread about the HR clerk who had placed third in qualifying, the unknown specialist with the African name who had appeared from nowhere to challenge the established order. Soldiers lined the observation area, curious to see if the rumors were true or if she would collapse under the pressure of real competition. Hensley arrived with his entourage, his competition rifle gleaming with fresh oil and expensive glass. He saw Yemisi setting up at her lane and stopped mid-stride, his eyes narrowing at the rifle in her hands. "Where is your scope?" he called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. Yemisi did not look up. "I do not need one." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Hensley smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Suit yourself, specialist. Iron sights at 300 meters. This should be entertaining." The round began at 0900 exactly. 8 shooters, 10 rounds each, precision scored on targets that suddenly seemed very far away without magnification. Yemisi watched the other competitors fire, watched their rounds punch neat holes in paper, watched Hensley deliver a masterful performance that put him firmly in first place. Then it was her turn. She settled behind the rifle, feeling the worn stock against her cheek, the familiar weight of the weapon against her shoulder. The iron sights were tiny at this distance, the front post barely visible against the target 300 meters downrange. Wind was light from the left, maybe 5 miles per hour. Temperature was warm, which would flatten her trajectory slightly. She did the calculations in her head the way her grandfather had taught her, adjusted her aim point, found the stillness. The first round broke clean. She did not need to see the impact to know it was good. 9 more followed, each one a meditation, each one a conversation between her and the rifle and the distant target. When she finished, her shoulder ached from the recoil and her eyes burned from the concentration, but she knew. The scorer walked downrange to retrieve the targets. The crowd waited in restless silence. Hensley watched with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. When the scores were announced, Yemisi had placed second, 2 points behind Hensley, with iron sights against his $4,000 scope. The crowd's murmur shifted from mockery to something else. Surprise. Respect. The beginning of belief. Hensley's expression did not change, but Yemisi saw his jaw tighten, saw the flicker of something in his eyes that looked almost like fear. "Lucky shots," he said to his entourage, loud enough for her to hear. "Iron sights are inconsistent. She will fall apart when it matters." But his voice lacked its usual conviction. Captain Miranda Vance intercepted Yemisi as she was packing her equipment. The range officer was a compact woman with sharp eyes and a reputation for strict adherence to regulations. "Specialist Adiyinka," she said. "A moment of your time." Yemisi straightened. "Yes, ma'am." Vance glanced around, ensuring they were not overheard. "I noticed you competed without a scope today. That is unusual for precision shooting at this distance." "My scope malfunctioned." "Malfunctioned." Vance's tone made the word a question. "May I see it?" Yemisi hesitated, then retrieved the damaged scope from her kit bag. She handed it to the captain without comment. Vance examined it with the practiced eye of someone who understood optics. Her expression hardened as she turned the adjustment dials and peered through the glass at the damaged reticle. "This did not malfunction," she said quietly. "This was deliberately sabotaged." "I know. Do you know who did it?" Yemisi met her gaze. "I have suspicions. No proof." Vance handed the scope back. "I am the range officer for this competition. My job is to ensure fair and safe execution of all events. If you file a formal complaint, I will investigate. And if I do not, then I will be watching very closely for the rest of this competition." Vance paused. "What happened here is not acceptable, but I cannot act without evidence or a complaint." Yemisi tucked the scope back in her bag. "Then I will give you neither, ma'am. I will handle this my way." Vance studied her for a long moment. "Your grandfather was Babatunde Adiyinka. I looked up your records after the first round. He was a legend. He was my teacher. Then show them what he taught you." Vance stepped back. "And specialist? Watch your back. Whoever did this is not finished." Yemisi nodded and walked away, carrying her damaged scope and her grandfather's rifle and the growing certainty that the next round would be the real test. She had proven she could compete with a handicap. Now she needed to prove she could win. The repair shop on post stayed open until 2100, a small building staffed by civilian contractors who serviced everything from tank optics to rifle scopes. Yemisi arrived at 2045 with her damaged scope and a request that made the technician behind the counter raise his eyebrows. "You want this fixed by tomorrow morning," he said. "That is not possible. The reticle housing is cracked. I would need to order parts, wait for delivery, then calibrate everything from scratch. We are talking a week minimum." Yemisi had expected this answer. She thanked him and left, walking back through the cooling Oklahoma evening toward her barracks. The competition would continue with or without her scope. She had proven she could shoot iron sights at 300 meters. The next round was 500. 500 meters with iron sights was a different challenge entirely. The front post would cover the entire target at that distance, making precise aim nearly impossible. Even her grandfather would have struggled with those conditions. But her grandfather had also taught her that obstacles were opportunities. Every problem contained its own solution if you were willing to look hard enough. She was still thinking about solutions when Command Sergeant Major Okonkwo fell in a step beside her. "I heard about your scope," he said without preamble. "Word travels fast on an installation this size." "I'm sure Hensley made certain of that." Okonkwo grunted. "He has been telling anyone who will listen that you are finished. That competing with iron sights at 500 meters is suicide." He paused. "Is he right?" Yemisi stopped walking and turned to face him. The base lights cast long shadows across his features, making him look older than his years. "My grandfather taught me to shoot in conditions that would make most soldiers quit before loading their first round," she said. "Sandstorms. Then, darkness so complete I could not see my own hands." He believed that skill was not about equipment. It was about the shooter. Okonkwo nodded slowly. But Batunde always said that a rifle was just metal and wood. The magic was in the hands that held it. "You knew him well. Well enough. We corresponded for years after that competition in 1987. He told me about you." Okonkwo reached into his pocket and withdrew a photograph, its edges worn soft from handling. "He sent me this 5 years ago. Said it was proof that his legacy would continue." Yemisi took the photograph and felt her breath catch. It showed her at 19, competing in a regional championship in New Mexico under a false name. She was mid-shot, her form perfect, her focus absolute. She had won that competition by 12 points. I never knew he sent this to anyone, she whispered. He was proud of you. Prouder than he ever let you see. Okonkwo took the photograph back. He also told me something else. Something about Hensley. Yemisi's eyes sharpened. What? They competed together, not just against each other. In 1984, they were both candidates for the Olympic shooting team. But Batunde made the final selection. Hensley did not. Okonkwo's expression darkened. He never forgave your grandfather for that. Spent the next 4 decades building a reputation at installations where Babatunde's name was not known, reinventing himself as a champion in a smaller pond. The pieces fell into place with sudden clarity. Hensley's hostility, his fear, the sabotage. This was not about her at all. It was about a rivalry that had started before she was born, a wound that had never healed, a defeat that still burned after 40 years. He hates me because of my grandfather, she said. He fears you because of what you represent. Okonkwo stepped closer, lowering his voice. You're not just competing against Hensley, specialist. You are competing against his entire self-image. Everything he has built here is based on being the best. If you beat him, with his own peers watching, using skills passed down from the man who ended his Olympic dreams, it will destroy him. And that is why he sabotaged my scope. I cannot prove that. Nobody can. Okonkwo shrugged. But I have watched Hensley for years. He surrounds himself with loyal soldiers who owe him favors. One of them could have easily accessed your barracks. What do I do? Okonkwo smiled, and there was something fierce in it. You do what your grandfather would have done. You walk onto that range tomorrow and show everyone that Wade Hensley has been a fraud for 40 years. You take his throne and make him watch while you sit in it. With iron sights at 500 meters. Babatunde once shot a perfect score at 600 meters during a monsoon. With iron sights, using a rifle older than this conversation. Okonkwo put a hand on her shoulder. You have his gift. You have his training. The only question is whether you have his courage. He walked away without waiting for an answer, leaving Yemisi alone under the base lights with a decision that felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. She returned to her barracks and sat with her grandfather's rifle across her knees. The scope was useless, but the iron sights remained. Simple metal posts that had guided countless rounds to their targets over decades of use. She thought about the photograph Okonkwo had shown her, about her grandfather, proud enough to share her achievements, but humble enough to never mention it. About Hensley, trapped in a prison of his own resentment, fighting a war against a dead man through his granddaughter. And she made her decision. Tomorrow she would not just compete. She would not just survive. She would show everyone at Fort Sill what the Adiyinka name truly meant. She would shoot with iron sights at 500 meters. And she would win. The third round began under a sky heavy with clouds, the wind gusting unpredictably across Range 4. 8 shooters remained, competing for 4 spots in the semifinals. Hensley was there, his expensive scope gleaming, his confidence restored by the challenging conditions. Yemisi set up at her lane with her grandfather's rifle, its bare iron sights drawing stares and whispers from the crowd. 500 meters. Variable wind. No magnification. Impossible. She found her position, settled her breathing, and let the stillness come. Her first round struck dead center. The second joined it, so close the holes overlapped. By her 10th shot, the scorer was shaking his head in disbelief. When the scores were posted, Yemisi Adiyinka had shot a perfect 40 out of 40, with iron sights, at 500 meters, in gusting wind. She had not just advanced. She had beaten Hensley by 6 points. The crowd erupted, but Yemisi did not hear them. She was looking at Hensley's face, watching his mask of confidence finally crack, watching him realize that everything he had built was about to come crashing down. And for the first time since her grandfather died, she felt him standing beside her, proud and present and very much alive. The aftermath of round 3 sent shockwaves across Fort Sill. By evening chow, every soldier on the installation seemed to know the story. The HR clerk with the old rifle, the impossible shots, the 3-time champion beaten by a specialist who had never competed before. Yemisi sat alone in the dining facility, her tray untouched, watching the reactions ripple through the room. Soldiers who had never noticed her before now stared openly, some with curiosity, some with admiration, a few with a particular resentment reserved for anyone who disrupted the established order. Staff Sergeant Dubicki slid into the seat across from her, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You look like you could use this." Yemisi accepted the cup without comment. Her hands were still steady, but something inside her was shaking. The stillness that had carried her through the competition was giving way to the reality of what she had done. "The whole base is talking about you," Dubicki said. "Perfect score with iron sights. At 500 meters. In that wind." She shook her head. "I knew you were good, Adiinka. I did not know you were supernatural." "I am not supernatural. I am just trained. By your grandfather." Yemisi nodded. "He started teaching me when I was 6 years old. 3 hours every day after school. More on weekends. By the time I was 12, I could outshoot most adults. By 16, I was competing in regional championships under false names so nobody would know who I was." "Why false names?" "Because he wanted to protect me." Yemisi stared into her coffee. He knew what this world does to people who stand out, especially women, especially black women. He wanted me to have the skills without the target on my back. Dubicki was quiet for a moment. "And now?" "Now the target is there whether I want it or not." A commotion near the entrance drew their attention. Hensley had entered the dining facility with his usual entourage, but something was different. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by a rigid tension that radiated from him like heat. His eyes found Yemisi across the crowded room and locked on. He started walking toward her table. Dubicki tensed. "You want me to stay?" "No." Yemisi set down her coffee. "This is between him and me." Dubicki hesitated, then nodded and left just as Hensley arrived. He stood over Yemisi's table, his hands clenched at his sides, his face a mask of controlled fury. "You think you were special," he said. His voice was low, meant only for her. "You think one lucky round makes you something." Yemisi looked up at him calmly. "I think I shot a perfect score with iron sights while you struggled with a scope worth more than my car. But I do not think that makes me special. I think it makes me trained." "Trained?" Hensley spat the word. "By Babatunde Adiinka, the great legend, the man who ruined my career before it even started." "He did not ruin anything. You lost the competition. It happens." Hensley leaned closer, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "He cheated. I know he cheated. Nobody shoots like that naturally. And neither do you. I do not know how you are doing it, but I will figure it out. And when I do, everyone will know that the Adiinka legacy is built on lies." Yemisi stood slowly, bringing herself eye to eye with him. Her voice was soft, but carried an edge that made nearby soldiers turn their heads. "My grandfather never cheated at anything in his life. He did not need to. He was simply better than you. And that is what you cannot accept. Not 40 years ago. Not now. The truth is not that he cheated. The truth is that you were never good enough, and you have spent your entire career hiding from that reality." Hensley's face went pale. For a moment, Yemisi thought he might strike her. His hands trembled with the effort of restraint. "The semifinals are tomorrow," he said finally. 600 meters. Real distance. Real pressure. You got lucky today. Tomorrow, you will learn what it means to compete against a real shooter." He turned and walked away, his entourage falling in behind him. The dining facility slowly returned to normal, conversations resuming, attention drifting elsewhere. But Yemisi remained standing, her heart pounding, the echo of her own words ringing in her ears. She had challenged him directly, called out his deepest insecurity in public. There was no going back now. Private First-Class Renner found her outside the dining facility, sitting on a bench in the cooling evening air. "That was intense," he said, dropping onto the bench beside her. "I thought he was going to explode." "He might still." Renner was quiet for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "Why did you hide it? All this time. You could have been competing, winning, getting recognized. Instead, you processed paperwork and pretended to be average. Why?" Yemisi considered the question. The honest answer was complicated, tangled up with grief and fear and the weight of expectations she had never asked for. Because being invisible was easier, she said finally. When nobody knows what you can do, nobody expects anything from you. Nobody is disappointed when you fail. Nobody resents you when you succeed. But you are not invisible anymore. No. She looked up at the darkening sky. Now everyone is watching. Everyone is waiting to see if I am real or if today was a fluke. And tomorrow, I have to prove it all over again. Renner hesitated, then spoke carefully. I overheard some of Hensley's guys talking after the round. They were angry, talking about how this could not stand, how they needed to do something before the semifinals. Yemisi turned to look at him. Something like what? I do not know. They shut up when they saw me listening, but did not sound like they were planning to congratulate you. She absorbed this information without surprise. The sabotage of her scope had been just the beginning. Hensley was desperate now, his reputation crumbling, his 40-year grudge exposed as nothing more than bitterness and inadequacy. Desperate men did desperate things. Thank you for telling me, she said. What are you going to do? Yemisi stood and looked toward the distant silhouette of Range 4, where tomorrow's semifinals would determine everything. I'm going to do what my grandfather taught me, she said. I'm going to show up. I'm going to shoot. And I'm going to win. She walked back toward her barracks, Renner's warning echoing in her mind. Whatever Hensley was planning, she would face it the same way she had faced every obstacle so far. With stillness, with skill, and with the legacy of a man who had never backed down from anything in his life. Sleep would not come. Yemisi lay in her barracks room, staring at the ceiling, her mind cycling through every possibility of what tomorrow might bring. Hensley's threat, Renner's warning, the weight of expectation pressing down on her like a physical force. At 0200, she gave up trying. She dressed in the darkness, pulled on her running shoes, and slipped out into the night. Fort Sill at 2 in the morning was a different world. Quiet, empty, the kind of stillness that her grandfather would have called sacred. She walked without destination, letting her feet carry her through the sleeping base, past darkened buildings and silent motor pools, until she found herself standing outside the base chapel. The doors were unlocked. They always were. She stepped inside and let the silence wrap around her. The chapel was non-denominational, designed to serve soldiers of every faith or none at all. Simple wooden pews, a modest altar, windows that would glow with colored light during the day but now showed only darkness. Yemisi sat in the front pew and placed her grandfather's rifle across her knees. She had carried it with her without consciously deciding to, the leather case a familiar weight against her shoulder. She did not pray. Her grandfather had not been a religious man, and she had inherited his skepticism along with his skill. But she sat in the silence and let her thoughts settle, the way sediment settles in still water, until only clarity remained. Tomorrow was not about Hensley. It was not about proving herself to Fort Sill or the Army or anyone else. It was about honoring the man who had poured everything he knew into her, who had believed in her potential before she could even understand what potential meant. She closed her eyes and let herself remember. The first time he placed a rifle in her hands. The patience in his voice as he corrected her grip. The quiet pride when she hit her first bullseye at 50 meters. The way he smiled when she finally understood that shooting was not about destruction, but about perfection. About finding the absolute limit of what she could achieve and pushing past it. He had given her everything. His knowledge, his skill, his legacy. All she had to do was accept it. She opened her eyes and looked down at the rifle. The worn stock, the aged metal, the iron sights that had guided her through the impossible. I am ready, she whispered to the empty chapel. I am ready to be your granddaughter. The silence did not answer. But somewhere deep inside her, something settled into place. A peace she had not felt since the day he died. She left the chapel as the first gray light of dawn touched the eastern horizon. The air was cool and still, carrying the promise of a clear day. Good shooting weather. Back at her barracks, she found Renner waiting outside her door. He looked like he had not slept either, his young face drawn with worry. They did something, he said without preamble. Hensley's guys. I followed them last night. They went to the range. Yemisi felt a cold knot form in her stomach. What did they do? I cannot get close enough to see, but they were at the 600-meter line for almost an hour, moving targets around, messing with something in the berms, sabotaging the range itself. It made sense. If Hensley could not beat her fairly, he would change the conditions until fair was no longer possible. Did you tell anyone? Who would believe me? Renner shook his head. I am a private who failed his last 2 qualifications. Hensley is a sergeant first class with 3 championship trophies. My word against his is not a fight I can win. Yemisi put a hand on his shoulder. You did the right thing by telling me. That is enough. What are you going to do? She thought about Captain Vance, the range officer who had recognized the sabotage of her scope. Thought about the promise to investigate if given evidence. But Renner was right. A private's suspicions were not evidence, and accusing Hensley without proof would only make her look desperate. I'm going to shoot, she said. Whatever they did, whatever traps they set, I am going to adapt and overcome. That is what soldiers do. Renner stared at her with something like awe. You're not afraid? I'm terrified. Yemisi smiled slightly. But my grandfather taught me that courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision that something else matters more. She went inside to prepare, leaving Renner standing in the early morning light. The semifinals began at 0900 under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. For shooters remained Hensley, Yemisi, a staff sergeant from the artillery battalion named Womack, a young specialist from military intelligence named Petrov, 600 meters, 10 rounds each. Precision scored. The crowd was larger than any previous round, word having spread that something historic was unfolding. Command Sergeant Major Okonkwo stood near the observation area, his face unreadable. Captain Vance moved along the firing line, checking equipment and ensuring protocols were followed. Yemisi set up at her lane and studied the range. At first glance, everything looked normal. Targets in position, berms intact, distance markers properly placed. But something felt wrong. A whisper of instinct that her grandfather had taught her to trust. She looked more carefully. The targets were standard issue, paper silhouettes mounted on wooden frames. But her target, lane 3, seemed slightly different. The angle was off by perhaps 2 degrees. Subtle enough to miss on casual inspection. Significant enough to throw off her aim at 600 meters. She glanced at Hensley, who was watching her with barely concealed anticipation, waiting for her to fail, waiting for his sabotage to work. Yemisi smiled. She had trained in sandstorms, in monsoons, in conditions that would break most shooters before they fired their first round. A target angled 2 degrees off-center was not an obstacle. It was an insult, and she was going to answer it with the only language that mattered. Perfect shots. The range officer called the line to order. Shooters took their positions. The first command echoed across the Oklahoma flatland. Ready on the right, ready on the left, already on the firing line. Yemisi settled behind her rifle, found her sight picture, and let the stillness come. Shooters, you may fire when ready. She adjusted her aim 0.2 degrees left, compensating for the sabotage without acknowledging it. Drew a breath, released half of it, found the space between heartbeats, and pulled the trigger. The first round struck center mass. Yemisi knew it before the scorer confirmed it. The way she always knew, the feedback traveling through the rifle and into her bones like a conversation in a language only she could hear. She fired again, and again, each shot a meditation, each trigger pull a prayer to the grandfather who had made this moment possible. Around her, the other shooters fired at their own pace. Hensley was methodical, his expensive scope giving him every advantage technology could provide. Womack was steady but unremarkable. Petrov showed flashes of skill but lacked consistency. Yemisi ignored them all. Her world had narrowed to the rifle in her hands, the iron sights aligned on a target 600 meters away, and the 2-degree compensation that turned sabotage into irrelevance. 10 rounds, 10 breaths, 10 moments of absolute stillness. When she finished, she cleared her weapon and waited. The scorers walked down range to retrieve the targets. The crowd shifted restlessly, conversations buzzing with speculation and anticipation. Hensley stood at his lane with his arms crossed, his expression caught somewhere between confidence and concern. Captain Vance collected the targets personally, her face betraying nothing as she examined each one. She conferred briefly with the official scorers, made notes on her tablet, then walked to the center of the range to announce the results. In fourth place, she called out Specialist Petrov, 31 out of 40. Eliminated. Petrov nodded and stepped back, his competition over. In third place, Staff Sergeant Womack, 34 out of 40. Eliminated. Womack saluted and withdrew, leaving only Yemisi and Hensley standing at the firing line. Vance paused, and something flickered in her eyes. A hint of surprise, a shadow of satisfaction. In second place, she announced Sergeant First Class Hensley, 38 out of 40. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Hensley's face went rigid. 38 was an excellent score. 38 should have been enough to win. In first place, Vance continued, her voice carrying clearly across the range, Specialist Adienka. 40 out of 40. Perfect score. The crowd erupted. Yemisi stood motionless as soldiers cheered and shouted around her. She did not celebrate, did not smile, did not acknowledge the impossible thing she had just done. She simply looked at Hensley and saw the moment his world collapsed. 40 years of resentment. 3 championships built on the absence of real competition. A reputation constructed in the shadow of a man he could never equal. All of it crumbling in the face of a specialist with iron sights and her grandfather's legacy. Hensley turned and walked off the range without a word. His entourage hesitated, uncertain, then followed him into the growing chaos. Staff Sergeant Dubicki reached Yemisi first, pulling her into a fierce embrace. "You did it," she said. "You actually did it. It is not over yet." Yemisi pulled back gently. "There is still the final round. The final round. 2 shooters, head-to-head. Winner represents Fort Sill at the All-Army Championship." But everyone watching knew the real contest had already been decided. Yemisi had beaten Hensley twice now, once with iron sights and once against his sabotage. The final round was a formality, unless Hensley found another way to cheat. Command Sergeant Major Okonkwo approached as the crowd began to disperse. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held something that might have been pride. "Your grandfather would have been pleased," he said simply. "I hope so." He was not a man who gave praise easily, but he would have praised this. Okonkwo glanced toward the direction Hensley had retreated. "Watch yourself tonight. A wounded animal is most dangerous when cornered." Yemisi nodded. "I know. The finals are tomorrow. Standard format with one addition." Okonkwo paused. The post commander added a special event. A demonstration shot. 3 targets aligned at different distances. 1 trigger pull. Yemisi felt her heart skip. The legacy shot. Her grandfather's signature. The impossible technique he had taught her exactly once on a quiet afternoon in Houston, calling it the Adienka family secret. "Has Hensley ever done this shot?" she asked. "He has practiced it for years. It is his way of honoring your grandfather, he claims." Okonkwo's tone made clear what he thought of that claim. He has never landed it perfectly, but he uses it to show off, to remind everyone that he trained with the best. The irony was almost painful. Hensley, desperate to claim connection to the man he blamed for ruining his career, using a technique he had stolen from observation and practice, not from trust and teaching. "I can make that shot," Yemisi said quietly. "I know you can." Okonkwo put a hand on her shoulder. "The question is whether you are ready to show the world who you really are. No more hiding. No more holding back. Just you and the rifle and the truth." Yemisi thought about her grandfather's letter, about the chapel in the darkness, about every moment of training, every hour of practice, every sacrifice that had brought her to this point. "I have been hiding my whole life," she said. "I think I am ready to stop." Okonkwo smiled. It was the first time she had seen him smile. "Then tomorrow, you show them what Babatunde Adienka created. You show them that his legacy did not die with him. It lives in you." He walked away, leaving her alone with the weight of tomorrow and the strange, unfamiliar feeling of being exactly where she was supposed to be. That night, she did not sleep. But this time, it was not from anxiety. It was from anticipation. Tomorrow, she would step out of her grandfather's shadow and into her own light. Tomorrow, she would become what he had always known she could be. Tomorrow, Yemisi Adeyinka would show them all. The final round drew the largest crowd Fort Sill had seen for a marksmanship competition in over a decade. Soldiers lined the observation area 3 deep, pressed against the safety barriers, craning for a view of the 2 shooters who would decide everything. Officers stood in clusters near the command tent, their presence lending weight to an event that had transcended sport and become something closer to legend. Yemisi arrived at 0830, her grandfather's rifle cradled in her arms. She had cleaned it 3 times the night before, checking every component, ensuring every mechanism functioned perfectly. The iron sights gleamed in the morning light, simple and elegant and utterly sufficient. Hensley was already there, surrounded by his remaining supporters. His face was a mask of controlled fury, the easy arrogance of the past week replaced by something harder and more desperate. He watched Yemisi approach with eyes that held no pretense of sportsmanship. This was war. They both knew it. Captain Vance called the competitors to the center of the range for the official briefing. Her voice carried clearly across the assembled crowd. The final round consists of 2 events, she announced. Event 1 is precision shooting at 800 meters, 10 rounds each. Highest score advances with a point advantage. Event 2 is the demonstration shot. 3 targets at 300, 500, and 700 meters, aligned on a single axis. 1 trigger pull, 3 hits required. Highest combined score wins the competition and represents Fort Sill at the All-Army Championship. She looked at both competitors. Any questions? Hensley spoke without looking at Yemisi. I want a rifle inspected. Iron sights at 800 meters is impossible without modification. She must be using something illegal. Vance's expression hardened. Specialist Adeyinka, do you consent to an equipment inspection? Of course. Yemisi handed over her grandfather's rifle without hesitation. It has been in my family for 40 years. There is nothing illegal about it. The inspection took 10 minutes. The armorer who examined the weapon found exactly what Yemisi knew he would find. A vintage rifle with original iron sights, standard barrel, no modifications of any kind. The weapon is clean, the armorer announced. Nothing illegal, nothing unusual, just an old rifle in excellent condition. Hensley's jaw tightened. He had no more delays to deploy, no more sabotage to attempt. The competition would proceed on its merits, and they both knew what that meant. Event 1 began at 0900. 800 meters with iron sights was the kind of challenge that separated competent shooters from extraordinary ones. At that distance, the front sight post covered the entire target. Wind became a critical factor, capable of pushing rounds inches off course. Even breathing at the wrong moment could mean the difference between a hit and a miss. Hensley fired first, his scope giving him every advantage. His shots were precise and methodical, landing in tight groupings that would have won any normal competition. When he finished, he had scored 37 out of 40, an excellent performance by any standard. Then it was Yemisi's turn. She settled behind her grandfather's rifle and let the world fall away. The crowd vanished. The pressure vanished. Even Hensley vanished, reduced to irrelevance by the absolute focus that her grandfather had spent 18 years cultivating. There was only the rifle, the target, the wind, the stillness. She fired her first round and knew it was perfect before the score confirmed it. The second followed, then the third. Each shot a conversation between her and the distant target. Each trigger pull an act of faith in the training that had brought her here. 10 rounds, 10 breaths, 10 moments of communion with everything her grandfather had given her. When the scores were announced, Yemisi had shot 39 out of 40, 2 points ahead of Hensley going into the demonstration shot. The crowd buzzed with disbelief. Iron sights at 800 meters, a score that elite military snipers would envy. From a human resources specialist who had been invisible 3 weeks ago. Hensley's face had gone pale. The point advantage meant Yemisi could afford to miss one target in the demonstration shot and still tie. He would need perfection just to force a tiebreaker. And everyone knew that Wade Hensley had never landed a perfect demonstration shot in his life. The range crew set up the 3 targets while the crowd settled into tense silence. 300 meters, 500 meters, 700 meters, aligned on a single axis, each target visible through the one in front of it, creating a corridor that demanded absolute precision. 1 bullet, 3 targets. The Adi Inca legacy shot. Hensley took his position first. He spent nearly a minute adjusting his scope, calculating angles, accounting for the slight variations in distance. The crowd held its breath. He fired. The bullet struck the first target dead center, passed through and hit the second target slightly left of center, continued on and struck the third target at the edge of the scoring zone. 3 hits, but not 3 bullseyes. The scorer announced his result. 3 targets hit. Total score, combining both events, gave Hensley a strong performance. But not perfection. Now it was Yemisi's turn. She walked to the firing line, carrying her grandfather's rifle. The iron sights caught the sunlight as she settled into position. No scope, no technology, just metal and wood and the skills of a dead man living on in his granddaughter. The crowd went silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Yemisi found her position, controlled her breathing. Let the stillness come one final time. She thought of her grandfather, his hands guiding hers, his voice in her ear, his absolute faith that she would one day stand exactly where she was standing now. "This is for you," she whispered, and pulled the trigger. The rifle kicked against her shoulder. The bullet flew true, crossing 300 meters in a fraction of a second, punching through the first target dead center. It continued on, velocity barely diminished, striking the second target at 500 meters. Dead center. It flew on still, reaching the final target at 700 meters, finding the bullseye with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. 3 targets, 3 bullseyes, 1 shot. The crowd exploded. Yemisi lowered the rifle and closed her eyes, feeling tears streak down her cheeks for the first time since her grandfather's funeral. She had done it. She had honored him. She had shown the world what the Adi Inca name truly meant. When she opened her eyes, Hensley was staring at her with an expression of complete devastation. His 40-year vendetta had ended not with his victory, but with his absolute and undeniable defeat. And standing at the edge of the crowd, Command Sergeant Major Okonkwo was holding up the old photograph, showing everyone nearby the image of Babatunde Adi Inca on the podium, victorious, eternal, living on through the granddaughter who had just proved herself as equal. The chaos that followed the demonstration shot was unlike anything Fort Sill had witnessed in years. Soldiers broke through the observation barriers, rushing toward the firing line to congratulate the specialist who had just accomplished the impossible. Officers abandoned their positions in the command tent, drawn by the commotion and the growing realization that they had witnessed something historic. But before the crowd could reach Yemisi, Command Sergeant Major Okonkwo stepped forward and raised his hand. The gesture carried the weight of 3 decades of authority, and the soldiers stopped in their tracks. "Before we celebrate," he said, his voice carrying across the range, "there is something you all need to understand. Something about who this young woman really is and why today matters beyond a marksmanship competition." He walked to the center of the range, the old photograph still in his hand, and turned to face the assembled crowd. 41 years ago, I competed in the 1984 Olympic shooting trials. I was young, confident, certain that I was destined for greatness. He paused. I finished third, not good enough to make the team. The man who finished first, the man who beat me by a margin I could not comprehend, was named Babatunde Adi Inca. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some of the older soldiers recognized the name. The younger ones simply listened, sensing that something important was being revealed. Babatunde was not just a shooter, Okonkwo continued. He was a phenomenon, a once-in-a-generation talent who made the impossible look routine. He went on to win medals that most of us only dream about. and then he disappeared from competitive shooting entirely. He turned to look at Yemisi, who stood motionless at the firing line, her grandfather's rifle still in her hands. He disappeared because he found something more important than trophies. He found a granddaughter with the same gift he had been born with, and he spent the last 18 years of his life teaching her everything he knew. Okonkwo held up the photograph. This is Babatunde Adeyinka in 1984, moments after qualifying for the Olympic team. And this, he gestured toward Yemisi, is his granddaughter, the woman he trained, the woman he believed would one day surpass even him. The crowd processed this information in stunned silence. Then someone started clapping. A single pair of hands, joined quickly by others, building into an ovation that echoed across the Oklahoma flatland. But Okonkwo was not finished. "There's more," he said, and the applause faded. Some of you may know that Sergeant First Class Hensley also competed in those 1984 trials. He finished fourth, one place below me, two places below Babatunde. All eyes turned to Hensley, who stood at the edge of the crowd with his remaining supporters. His face had gone ashen. For 40 years, Okonkwo continued, Hensley has carried a grudge against the man who beat him, a grudge that he transferred to that man's granddaughter when she appeared at this competition, a grudge that led him to sabotage her equipment and manipulate this event in ways that violate everything the Army stands for. Captain Vance stepped forward, her expression grim. She held up a tablet displaying photographs and maintenance logs. "I have documented evidence that Specialist Adeyinka's scope was deliberately tampered with before round 2, she announced. "I also have witness statements indicating that the targets at Lane 3 were manipulated before the semifinals." She looked directly at Hensley. "The investigation is ongoing, but the preliminary findings point to personnel under Sergeant First Class Hensley's direct supervision." The crowd's mood shifted from celebration to something harder. Soldiers who had cheered Hensley's victories for years now looked at him with new eyes. The champion they had admired was being revealed as something far less worthy of admiration. Hensley tried to speak, to defend himself, but no words came. His mouth opened and closed uselessly as the weight of exposure crushed whatever remained of his composure. Staff Sergeant Dubicki pushed through the crowd to stand beside Yemisi. She took the younger woman's hand and squeezed it once, a gesture of solidarity that said more than words ever could. Yemisi finally spoke, her voice quiet but carrying clearly in the silence that had fallen. "I did not come here to destroy anyone," she said. "I came here to honor my grandfather, to prove to myself that his belief in me was not misplaced." She looked at Hensley with something that might have been pity. "He was not your enemy. He was just better than you. And hating him for 40 years did not change that. It only poisoned you." Hensley's supporters had begun to drift away, unwilling to be associated with the scandal that was unfolding. He stood alone now, a 3-time champion whose legacy was crumbling in real time. The post commander, a colonel who had been watching from the command tent, stepped forward and addressed the crowd. "Specialist Adeyinka is the winner of this competition and will represent Fort Sill at the All-Army Championship," he announced. "As for Sergeant First Class Hensley, he is hereby suspended from all marksmanship duties pending a full investigation into the allegations presented today." It was over, not with a dramatic confrontation, but with the quiet weight of truth finally spoken aloud. Dubicki pulled Yemisi into a hug as the crowd began to disperse. "You did it," she whispered. "You did everything he hoped you would do." Yemisi held the embrace for a long moment, feeling the tension of the past weeks finally begin to release. When she pulled back, her eyes were wet, but her smile was genuine. "He always told me that skill was not about defeating others," she said. "It was about achieving your own perfection." She looked down at the rifle in her hands. "I think I finally understand what he meant." Private First Class Renner appeared at her side, beaming with pride that seemed almost personal. "So what happens now?" Yemisi considered the question. The All-Army Championship was months away. The investigation into Hensley would take weeks. Her life at Fort Sill would never be the same. But none of that mattered as much as the simple truth that settled over her like a blessing. "Now," she said, "I stop hiding. Now I become what my grandfather always knew I could be. She looked out at the range where she had just made history, where her grandfather's legacy had been proven and her own had begun. Now I am Yemisi Adiyinka, and the world is going to know my name. 3 days after the competition, Yemisi received a visitor she had not expected. She was in her barracks room, cleaning her grandfather's rifle for the 100th time when the knock came. She opened the door to find two soldiers in dress uniforms standing at attention. Behind them, a woman in civilian clothes with the bearing of someone who had spent decades in military service. Specialist Adiyinka, the woman said. My name is Colonel Patricia Reeves, retired. I represent the United States Army Marksmanship Unit. May we speak with you? Yemisi stepped aside to let them enter. Her small room suddenly felt even smaller with 3 visitors and the weight of whatever they had come to say. Colonel Reeves did not waste time with pleasantries. We have been aware of your grandfather for many years, she began. But Batunde Adiyinka was one of the finest precision shooters this country has ever produced. When he chose to retire from competition, the shooting community lost something irreplaceable. Yemisi said nothing, waiting for the point she knew was coming. We have also been watching you, Reeves continued. Not just this competition. For years, your grandfather was not as secretive as he believed. We knew about the regional championships, the false names, the scores that defied explanation. You have been tracking me? We have been waiting for you. Reeves smiled slightly, waiting for the moment when you were ready to step out of his shadow and into your own light. Based on what happened 3 days ago, that moment has arrived. She reached into her briefcase and withdrew a folder bearing the insignia of the Army Marksmanship Unit. This is a formal invitation to try out for the AMU, Reeves said. If you make the team, you would train full-time at Fort Moore. Compete at the national and international level. Represent the United States in precision shooting events around the world. Yemisi took the folder but did not open it. The offer was everything her grandfather had prepared her for. Everything he had dreamed she might one day achieve. And yet, I need time to think, she said. Reeves nodded as if she had expected this response. Of course. The tryouts are in 4 months. You have until then to decide. She stood to leave, then paused at the door. Your grandfather wrote to us once, years ago. He said he was training someone who would one day surpass him. Someone who had the gift, but also had the heart. He asked us to watch for her, to be ready when she was ready. Her eyes met Yemisi's. We have been ready for a long time, specialist. The question is whether you are. They left without further ceremony, leaving Yemisi alone with the folder and the rifle and the decision that would shape the rest of her life. That evening, she found Command Sergeant Major Okonkwo at Range 4, standing in the fading light, looking out at the targets that had witnessed so much over the past week. They made you an offer, he said without turning around. It was not a question. The Army Marksmanship Unit. Tryouts in 4 months. Okonkwo nodded slowly. Your grandfather spoke of this. He believed you would one day compete at the highest levels. Represent your country. Carry the Adiyinka name on his stages he never reached. He reached for those stages. He qualified for the Olympics. And then he chose something else. Okonkwo finally turned to face her. He chose you. He chose to pour everything he had into the next generation rather than chasing his own glory. That was his decision. Now you have to make yours. Yemisi looked down at the folder in her hands. The AMU insignia caught the last rays of sunlight. What would he want me to do? Okonkwo smiled. He would want you to stop asking what he would want. He would want you to decide for yourself. That is what he trained you for. Not just to shoot, to think, to choose, to become your own person, not just an extension of his legacy. The words settled over her like a blessing and a burden. Her grandfather had given her everything. Now she had to decide what to do with it. She spent the night walking the base, visiting the places that had shaped her over the past week. The range where she had first revealed her skill. The chapel where she had found peace. The dining facility where she had confronted Hensley. The barracks room where she had opened her grandfather's letter. By dawn, she had her answer. She found Dubicki at the HR building, arriving early for the morning shift. Her supervisor took one look at her face and knew. You're leaving us, Dubicki said. I'm going to try out for the AMU. Yemisi paused. My grandfather spent his whole life preparing me for something bigger than processing paperwork. I think it is time I honored that. Dubicki pulled her into a hug. He will be proud. Hell, I am proud. She pulled back and grinned. Go show those AMU shooters what Fort Sill is made of. The next 3 months passed in a blur of preparation and training. Yemisi spent every available hour at Range 4, pushing herself harder than she ever had before. Soldiers came to watch, at first out of curiosity, then out of genuine respect for the specialist who had beaten their champion and was now preparing for an even bigger stage. Private First Class Renner became her unofficial assistant, helping with equipment, tracking her scores, and providing the kind of earnest encouragement that only the young can offer. On her last day at Fort Sill, he found her at the range one final time. I want to ask you something, he said nervously. Before you go, ask, will you teach me? Not to shoot like you. I know that is impossible, but to shoot better than I do now. To find that stillness you talk about. Yemisi looked at him, this young soldier who had believed in her before anyone else, who had warned her about Hensley's sabotage, who had stood by her when it would have been easier to stay invisible. She handed him a rifle. First, she said, you learn to breathe. The words were her grandfather's. The moment was her own. And as she watched Renner settle into position, watched him try to find the stillness between heartbeats, she understood finally what Babatunde Adiyinka had been teaching her all along. Skill was not about defeating others. It was not about trophies or recognition or proving doubters wrong. Skill was about the sacred responsibility of passing on what you had been given, about ensuring that the gift did not die with you, but lived on in the hands of those who came after. She was Yemisi Adiyinka, her grandfather's student, her own woman, and now a teacher herself. The legacy continued. If this story moved you, drop a comment below and let us know your favorite moment. Tell us if you have ever witnessed someone reveal a hidden talent that shocked everyone around them, or share a memory of someone in your life who believed in you before you believed in yourself. We would love to hear your story.